Hello and welcome to Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson and this is my co-host
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And today we are tackling a difficult, important, complex topic which will require probably more than one program to cover, and this will be an ongoing conversation for us. And the topic is white privilege. And it's something that we need to all talk more about, think more about, do more about.
I think that's true, yeah.
And yet, it isn't easy to grasp the significance of it and our participation in it.
Right. I think, you know, as a woman, I first encountered the concept of male privilege. And I thought, yeah, I understand that, because in that case, I was the one oppressed, so I could see it. I could see how it operated. I could see I was operating within it. But when people began to talk about white privilege, it took me a while to begin to figure out how that was intended, how it operated. And I'm still very new to this concept and learning about it, but I'm really eager to be educated. And I think I'm often confused by it. Are you? I mean, how do you come into it?
Oh, yes. I think I've been, in one way or another, coming to terms with this. Coming to terms is actually a good expression, isn't it? Because there are a lot of terms. What do we mean by white privilege? What do we mean by racism or prejudice? All those things that go with it. And I, too, like you with male privilege, when you're the oppressed, it's easier to see. When you're the oppressor, we resist knowing that. We resist seeing that. And I was part of a poverty reduction initiative in this community for a while. And there was talk about that poverty was a system. It wasn't just about not having enough money, that it was a whole complex system that kept people in difficult circumstances. And that was really hard for many of us to grasp because we weren't in poverty.
Right, and to recognize that you were part of a system.
Yes.
You know, and it's a throwback to not a throwback, but it reminds me of the term, you know, we used in the 60s when I was, you know, actively involved in some political work. In the 60s, we talked about, very disparagingly, the system, and not always recognizing our own role in it. That's the really serious thing that has changed, is that now we talk about a system of racism as different, I think, from prejudice.
Yes.
But overlapping, and we are part of it.
And a system can be created.
Right.
And therefore, we assume that it could be changed, but it would require us to change with it.
Yes, and that's where we are, isn't it? It's like we are trying to figure out what it is, what its terms are, and how we identify it within ourselves, and what role are we playing in this system now?
And what can we do?
Yeah, and what can we do? And I think I like what our guests today have said, is that we all need to be students of this.
And therefore not be reluctant to admit we don't know.
Right, right.
We don't know nearly as much as we need to.
But in terms of
what we want to learn.
Right, right. And we have to open the conversation somewhere and just enter into, okay, what does this feel like? And recognize our discomfort, and also recognize then how we can begin to learn and identify.
Perfect segue. So let's bring
our
two students on,
our guest
who can tell
students
us what some things we need to learn.
We'll be right back.
Hello and welcome back to Ideas Live. We're embarking on a conversation about white privilege. This is my co-host
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And we have two wonderful guests with us today. Anne McPhail, who describes herself as actively retired, welcome.
Whatever that means.
And Tori Craig, who is with Rotary Charities. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
These brave women participated recently in a workshop on white privilege earlier this year, and therefore have some really valuable background and experiences that Anne-Marie and I do not have. And although we all call ourselves students in this area of discussion, we really welcome the insights that you will bring to us from some of the conversations that you've had. I think it would be helpful, before we get into specifics, to talk about some definitions. I mean, what do we mean by white privilege? Can either one of you sort of help us parse out that definition?
A common definition you will read is that it's unearned power conferred on white people on the basis of race. Yeah.
So when you say unearned power, that is, we were sort of born into the system that gives us chances that other people don't have, and that's a form of power?
Yes, if you think about people being disadvantaged, there's a corollary to that, which is being advantaged. And so in a highly racialized society, which we live in, white people are advantaged, and black, dark-skinned people are disadvantaged. So we have privilege whether we recognize it or not, just given, you know, this power structure.
That's helpful.
That's helpful, and because we are sort of in the midst of it, we don't always see it. We don't always understand that it's happening to us, even though it is, because we're not on the oppressed side of that. Is that how you, or is that, am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that there's a system, when we talk about racism, we'll talk more about it, but a system that rewards you for not being aware of your whiteness.
Right.
Or for me being aware of my whiteness or my advantage. So it's not visible to white people in this country, but certainly for African Americans or, you know, black and brown skinned people, indigenous people, it's very obvious to them. They think about race all the time. Do we think about, how often do we think about race? We don't have to. If we don't want to, we're not confronted with it all the time. And so this is part of that.
If you think about it, there's also this kind of national narrative about being created equal, equality. I mean, there's a lot of that that's kind of, especially in a political year, and we talk about equality, and so we kind of assume that that's true. Everyone has equal opportunity, and it's false.
Yeah, it's a myth. Yeah,
and that's reinforced in our education system and in the media. You know, in our social relationships, we're always reinforcing for each other that idea that we live in the greatest country in the world. Some people say liberty and justice for all, but as white folks, we have a lot of learning to do about what's really happened in the past and what is happening today.
Okay. So why don't you address, like, there's the white privilege question, we've kind of got that on the table, the whole difference between prejudice and racism.
Sure, yeah, so prejudice, to have a prejudice is to hold an opinion or an idea that then creates kind of your perception of someone else, whereas racism is about refers to a system of power.
That seems really important today, because I think many of us, we would claim that we're not prejudiced, but when you take that kind of definition, you realize, oh, it's almost impossible not to have some prejudice.
Right.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and there's also, it's tempting to say I'm not racist. When in fact, you know, one of the books that was on the reading list for this experience that you had, and I did read it, is called White Fragility. And in that book, the author, Robin DiAngelo, says that we in fact are all racist. It's just a given.
Right.
Because we're embedded in this system of racism.
Right, and it's just in the fabric of society that's all around us. So we're raised within this kind of myth of racism, and racism can be interpersonal, it can be systemic. It's really just baked into the fabric of the way that our society is constructed.
So in a way to deal with it, excuse me, we have to move into an area of discomfort right from the get-go.
Yes, I think I'd like the idea that racism doesn't require intent. People tend, when they hear that, they're telling me I'm racist, but I don't want to be, I don't try to be. It's not about intent. It is about the society around you is a racially, charged society. So we are all racist, and it is an uncomfortable conversation to have. Really important conversation to have. But I do want to say that I am a student in this. I am, I have a lot to learn. There's language, there's gaps in my history, there's new concepts. So I'm sort of beginning this journey. So I don't want to be seen as somebody who knows an awful lot about it. But
I think we all are. I mean, we're all just starting to open up this conversation. And it's part of, I think, the slow acknowledgement of how this has operated in our world for so long without acknowledgement, and we're coming to it as we can. So I appreciate what you're saying.
So, because we're students and new at this, I admire the fact that you both were willing to spend, I think it was 3 weekends this past year, with a group of people focused on this topic. And can you each say a little bit about what prompted you to participate in this?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll back it up a little bit to give you some context. So I grew up in a majority white suburban town outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And I think, like many white folks, didn't learn much about privilege or power until I went to college. And at the same time, around that age, I was learning to grow food and cook food for the first time for myself and really getting excited and passionate about food, and started to ask questions about why healthy food is available to some communities and not to others. And so I left school and worked for a few different nonprofits in food access and education and hunger relief. And there are lots of amazing leaders of color in the food movement. So as I was learning about the field, I was reading a lot and started to investigate what is an appropriate role for a young white woman coming into communities of color and working alongside people to reclaim their power in the food system. And realized that though I had come in with good intentions to help folks, that I wasn't acknowledging this whole system of power and privilege that creates pockets of hunger and oppression. So as I was learning from folks in the field, I started to realize that just as important as it was to learn about those structures of oppression and of structural racism in the food system, that I needed to investigate my personal ancestral lineage and history around racism to understand what it means to be white in this society where I've been afforded more privileges, for example, access to healthy food, than others. So I had done some trainings in other places. I moved to Northern Michigan 2 years ago and wanted to meet other white people who were interested in having this conversation. So that I could be in community to really process and then work alongside communities of color here to support their efforts to build a more just society.
Yeah,
it's a great example of how embedded in the system, how it reaches out to every aspect of life. That's really...
And starting with such an essential thing as food. I mean, that's amazing. And what about you?
So I come to this, being a retired person, so at the end of a career, but I've always been concerned about oppression in our society. I studied in college international development, which is really the study of colonialism, and then aid to try and, fix some of the resulting inequities. And it wasn't a successful process. It still isn't terribly successful, but I went into the Peace Corps, and I'd always wanted a bigger world. So as soon as I had the opportunity, I studied another language, and that was French. and I wanted to get out into the world, and so the Peace Corps took me to West Africa, which is colonized by the French, so I had part of the language. And it was a wonderful experience being a non-majority person in a culture where everyone else was very comfortable in their black skin. And I come from a suburb of Detroit where that was a very unusual experience. So, you know, I've had my moments of education and awareness, but I never, and then I went out to work in an international organization where I was kind of shocked to realize that racism is global. There is a hierarchy of race, and I just didn't know. I was really, you know, that ignorant. So I think this workshop offered me something that I longed for, something you said. I longed to talk about race. I longed to understand why it's hanging on. And there wasn't really a space for, as a white person, in all my ignorance and my desire to upend the injustice, to talk about it and learn about it in this brave, wow, I have to show my ignorance kind of way. And so this workshop, I came to it as an individual, just wanting to make sure I'm not part of continuing, you know, the survival of racism as, you know, a multi-thronged you know, system in this country.
Yeah, I think that whole idea of okay, I might not be able to solve the whole thing, but not continuing my part is a big motivator at this point.
I don't know if it was the name of the workshop, but throughout our conversations about it, you called it the Doing Our Own Work workshop. And I love that because it reminds us that it's one thing to sort of have a global understanding about it, but then each of us needs to own our particular piece of it,
right.
Our participation, and the need for educating ourselves and the need to actually do something.
And that people of color, that's a qualified term, we've talked about that, but they're not responsible for educating us.
Right.
We need to.
That was news to me. I mean, I thought, well, all I have to do is invite them to tell me what I need to know. Oh, that's not how it works.
No.
I mean, how offensive, really. I mean, a good example of how our ignorance can be really offensive.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
So what are some, and this is impossible to cover in the time we have, but a couple of key, you know, kind of takeaways from the workshops that you participated in that were maybe aha moments for you, or that really have nourished your understanding of this issue.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is one of the first exercises that we did as a group together, which was this timeline.
Oh, you mentioned that's wonderful.
Racism and also of resistance since the beginning of our country's existence. And it's a really powerful experience because it's really hard to put things on the timeline. And we realized together that white people have a lot of catching up to do, and that's part of what's meant about doing our own work.
So what was the timeline? I mean, were you putting down historical moments that you understood, like the Emancipation Proclamation, and things like that?
Like 1600 on, right? I think that's where we started.
Identifying moments in time where racist actions occurred and also where people were resisting. And it was just really hard to put events on the timeline, to recall dates.
So the point of that was to sort of acknowledge what we didn't know. So, and how, were there other people at the table who did know?
Yeah, and that was part of what was interesting for me, and reaffirming that it's so important that we do this work intergenerationally, because there were a lot of the older folks in the room had more knowledge about things that were happening, you know, back in the day, and folks who are my age, I had a lot more things to put on the timeline, you know, like names of victims of police brutality and hashtags from the Black Lives Matter movement, things that are happening right now that I'm learning about and working to be a part of, but I had large gaps in my historical kind of knowledge. So, and that was enriching throughout the experience, that we had people coming from different generations who were able to kind of add their experience to the conversation. But ultimately it was just hard to put things on the timeline.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Just
So much to say.
the reason we don't know, I mean, it hasn't been part of the curriculum,
Right.
you know, in school or in conversation. Again, it's that sort of obliviousness.
Or it's been only, I mean, I do remember learning about the civil rights movement in a deeper way, even though I lived through some of it, but in a protected family and did far cry from it. And but learning about that, so some of it. But it seems now, looking back with a little bit more complete awareness, that it was very selective.
Yes. And you know, the statues that we have around our country are often statues of colonizers or Confederate generals. And the history that's in our history books was written by the victors, right? The oppressors. And in our family stories, I know in my family, talking to my elders, there are some things that they say, we just don't talk about that. There are a lot of secrets and a hidden history of white racism and oppression that's painful to acknowledge now, or that maybe we feel like we're not a part of in our generation, but it's part of our lineage.
So one thing that stands out for me about that timeline exercise, it was much easier for people to identify current events that were, you know, racist. I had always been mindful of the mistreatment, genocide of Native Americans in this country, and we could start with a few things on that timeline, but just a few things. So you see, oh yeah, I know it's there, but I don't know anything about the history, partly because it's not in the curriculum. And just to circle back a little bit on this notion of doing our own work, so if I show up to a conference, let's say looking at indigenous rights or land rights or things like that, and I go in with this gap in my timeline, the chances of me saying something that reveal how white people know so little about the experience of indigenous people and will trigger for indigenous people, oh my God, here's somebody else who doesn't know their history. So it was a great way to start off, getting very humble and also seeing the magnitude, you know, and over time. And you think, well, there's been change, but yet why do we come up with so many instances of very recent racism? I mean, what does this say about the efforts to put an end to it or to stop perpetuating it?
I think I've been guilty, I mean, a great many things, no doubt, in this area of conversation, but I've been guilty until recently of thinking that's in the past. I mean, that was slavery, or Native Americans, that was hundreds of years ago, and not realizing that there are people alive today who were in the boarding schools, for example, with Native Americans. And I was having a conversation with a woman, I think, who came on this program to talk about some other things related to that culture, but you know, she had that experience, and it was just one of those awful moments for me of thinking, I don't have a clue. I mean, this is not history for them. This is now.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and their daily existence, and has always been.
Yeah.
And mass incarceration, you know, I mean, we're still, just as much as people now are living with trauma from things that happened in the past, our society is also perpetuating racial violence today, police brutality.
Yeah.
And a part of my doing my own work, so I come at this having had a career, and I can look back on that career and see how the advantages, the unearned advantages I had in an international organization as a native English speaker, as someone who really learned how to write, and as we talk later, writing is sacred in white culture. And I look at my colleagues that were far more academically advanced than I were. They had PhDs, they were subject matter experts, and yet I advanced faster than they did. And one was from China. Had a different mentality, right? So the way this person may have expressed something reflected cultural values that were not the dominant white cultural values. And so it took her longer to be heard, to be seen. Another colleague from West Africa, a world-renowned expert in his field, took him a long time, and then I think in the end he was defeated by racism, and he had to leave the organization. So I think about, okay, I need to own my advantage here. And I think that's a big part of doing your own work. It's a really hard part of doing your own work to look at, because white people, a lot of white people, I've heard people say this, I can say this in some ways, I'm not privileged. You know,
I grew up
partly it's a meritocracy, and I earned, you know, some of what I got, but I also benefited from government programs. You know, my father was a veteran. I got into a college without much difficulty. I got financial aid. We lived in a nice house, which is where white people really accrue their capital. So there's lots of ways that I can just see that I had these advantages. And so the corollary exists. Other people did not, and where are they today? And what does that say? So, you know, there is hard work and on self-reflection. And what do I want to do about that? How do we, you know, how do I contend with that?
Yeah.
And that's a big, deep subject.
Yeah, and what are some of the ways that you think that we can begin to do beyond our own educating ourselves historically and culturally about the presence of it? What are the active things that can be done? What do you think?
Like, can you each give an example of something you're personally trying to do in your sphere of influence to change what is?
Sure. I first want to say that I think part of the beauty of this training, doing our own work, was coming together in community with other white people to be supported in a space where we can be ourselves and feel our emotions, but not dominate the conversation in spaces where we're trying to support people of color. So that work of learning together and building relationships, supporting each other, holding each other accountable is so central to then doing disruptive actions.
Yeah.
So in my sphere of influence, I work for a local foundation called Rotary Charities, and we have, in the last 3 years, expanded our scope of giving and supporting to help nonprofit organizations try to change systems and start to really move upstream on complex problems. And part of that, what comes along with that is acknowledging these complex problems that in philanthropy we've been working on for years, like hunger and homelessness and climate change. Often the people who are most directly affected by those inequities are communities of color. So how do we support nonprofit organizations to work more authentically and respectfully with these frontline communities, with the people who are really experiencing the negative effects of these systems in a way that invites them to the table to help make decisions and help create the solutions that are meant to serve them. So I'm supporting developing that strategy, how we support nonprofits to do that work in a way that's more respectful.
Yeah, that's important because they're on the ground, you know.
Right.
Yeah, that's sort of.
What about you, Anne?
Well, so I've moved to this area after living in DC for so long, and I'm in an area that was occupied by indigenous people. Yes. I have land, I have wetlands, and I'm trying to be much more mindful about, well, how did I get here? How do I be a good steward of the land? How do I maybe use my voice or my resources to amplify issues of indigenous people? So there's this problem of murdered and missing indigenous women. And a lot of people have never heard of that. Hashtag MMIW came up in the Women's March. I heard it at this conference we both attended in Baraga. And these issues, you know, the Native American community is very small, less than 1% in the US. So you have to give amplification to some of these issues. These rains, the floods in the West, they affected indigenous people living on reservations much more. And you didn't hear too much about that. So it's, in a way, it's saying, wow, we gotta lift up voices and not just, so it's not about me and my voice. It's about people that aren't sitting at that table because they have resources or, you know, whatever, credentials, but, you know, allowing other people's voices to be heard. So a lot of it is personal. I need to really kind of rethink my ways of being in the world. We'll talk about white culture maybe a little bit. I'm somebody raised on white culture, got to solve that problem, strategize, write it down, you know, all of these things that aren't the way other people work necessarily, and maybe exclude other people. Maybe my, you know, my willingness to jump in is actually making somebody go, whoa, this person, you know, they don't step in. So it's changing, you know, my behaviors, being very mindful about the ways that I might, you know, I don't know, be taking over, or say you're taking up space when I really need to be making space. I need to be stepping back.
That's a nice way to say it. Yeah, let's talk about that. We're we're going to run out of time. We knew we would. That there are some characteristics of white culture that are largely invisible to us because it's just the way the world is. And it's the way we run our organizations and the way we operate in our neighborhoods and communities. But they aren't necessarily the way people of color would operate if the choice were theirs. So what are some of these characteristics of white culture? You've mentioned writing is of value, getting things done.
Perfectionism. So perfectionism is a tricky one. And let's just say these are norms and standards that are, you know, taken as given. They're not necessarily discussed by a group or chosen by a group. They're just there. And they represent the preferences mostly of people in power. So they don't represent the way other people necessarily want to work and behave. So that's, you kind of have to recognize that. So the list includes, you know, the sense of urgency, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, there's only one right way, either or thinking, right? It's good, it's bad, it's for, it's against, power hoard. I mean, there's a lot of elements to this culture that for white people are invisible to us because, you know, I don't know, we're just raised on it. And we're raised as white is the norm, right? So when you talk about a white person, I always like this analogy, a white person can stand in for a person, anybody. But, you know, an African American, no, they can only represent their race. You know, these are ways in which white
Perception
culture,
is really set.
we don't have to think about it because we're everywhere. We're in the history books. We're, you know, we're the leaders.
We wrote the history books.
And so it's a norm, it's a standard that, again, advantages people of white skin. Not necessarily the best people in the room or the people most able to handle a problem. It just confers this, you know, this fallacy.
What are a couple examples of values of other cultures that we could substitute for or add to this list of white cultural? I mean, I think.
You mean as antidotes?
Yeah, antidotes or additions to.
Yeah.
I mean.
Well, in the spirit of our training, I think that we're making an effort to build into our white culture as we hold each other in this space of learning and stepping into activism, just a culture of listening and a culture of patience, not being afraid of making a mistake, acknowledging that stepping into an uncomfortable conversation is where learning happens, so being open to that experience. What you were sharing, Anne, about the characteristics of white culture made me think about hierarchy, you know, how we have created our organizations based on hierarchical structures, but we have an opportunity to come to the table as equals, that we're all learning and supporting each other in that way. Yeah, and then inviting, you know, the spectrum of emotion that we experience when we talk about really challenging, scary, angry-making things like racism and oppression, right? Being able to be really angry because there's space for anger and we should be angry about what's happening, allowing each other space to grieve and really be sad, feeling our joy fully, dancing and laughing, all of these things in the white culture that I grew up in were not necessarily welcome, right? You kind of, you're fine, everything's fine, you're operating within this box of cultural norm, maintaining the status quo, but not moving through that really natural flow of emotion. And I think that in other cultures, there's more space to feel everything that you feel and to share that.
I have felt really envious ever since I heard about this conference, which I was this workshop that I was not able to attend, that you have this community now. I mean, you're participating as a group, and you talked about the value of being in a group, excuse me, holding each other accountable, holding each other safe.
And
for those of us,
learning
together.
Yeah, I think that's the critical thing, is that you don't feel like you're so alone taking these risks by yourself.
So not all of us have a chance, chance to be part of a group. What can we do as individuals, or can we create little groups to keep the conversation going and to keep the learning going? I mean, it's hard as a solitary person to know enough or feel supported enough to go forward.
I think it's a great idea to create groups with people that you know and are interested in entering into this conversation with, and then using the writing or speaking videos featuring people of color they're talking about a vision for a new way forward. So how do we sit together as white folks and talk about racism? We can talk about racism in a room where there are no people of other races, right? It's important that we do, but do it in a way that we're being accountable to people of color and learning about racism, talking about it in ways that are not in themselves oppressive.
So racism, there's an analogy that it's a conveyor belt, and it just is going and going and going. And I think this idea that we have to step off that conveyor belt if we want to have any meaningful impact. So we do have to have groups. We do have to we have to do our own work, and it's best done with other people because of the support and just the insights. And so if we don't do the work, then racism continues. So yes,
I would hope to see maybe some additional conversations in our community, so that those of us who weren't part of the workshop can get involved, and that we can keep it going in a more productive and meaningful way.
And there are opportunities for people to be engaged in other kinds of trainings. I think that doing our own work, Allies for Change is the organization that brought that here, alliesforchange.org. And I believe they have the intention to bring the training here again, but not everyone will be able to attend, right? And to give 3 weekends of your time is in and of itself a privilege. But there are resources out there.
And maybe there are other little informal venues throughout our community where we can be having these conversations if we're intentional about it.
I mean, there's some great books, book clubs. There's some great videos.
Book clubs, that's a good
there's
idea.
So many resources out there. That would help continue this exploration of who are we in this racialized society.
Don't you think the beginning for so many people is to say the words that we are a part of white privilege, and we need to understand how and what to do? I mean, just to say that.
Absolutely.
I'm advantaged.
Advantage might be an easier entry ramp, I'm not sure.
Right, but you're absolutely right. But I still think that finally facing that, it's like my conversations with my men friends, helping them understand male privilege. They're offended by that at first, but then as the conversation becomes more open, that resolves.
Right, and that's holding on to that expert feeling, right?
Yeah,
I've never experienced that, so that can't be real. But we have to believe people. We have to believe women. We have to believe trans people, queer people, and we have to believe people of color when they're saying there's a system that's going on here, and we're being oppressed, and in fact, some of us are dying. And it's the responsibility of white people to show up and say, I hear you, and I'm ready to learn.
Yeah,
very important.
That seems like a really important place to end. I hear you, and I'm ready to learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all your insights and learning experiences.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
We'll be back. Hello, and welcome back to our wrap-up conversation about white privilege. I wanted to mention during the conversation this issue of National Geographic, which was from April of 2018, and the entire issue was devoted to discussions of racism and white privilege. And the editor of this magazine began by owning some of the racism that has been explicit in the National Geographic's history. But there are really extraordinary articles throughout the magazine, and I want to mention this was one about showing the the colors of a group of citizens which are linked to that system of colors that graphic designers use and label Pantone colors. And it's a beautiful graphic example of how varied our colors are. We're not all white. We're not all the same.
And if I remember correctly, the cover issue is, these are fraternal twins.
Yes.
These
the black father and a white mother, and
yes,
it's a wonderful issue. I'm sure you can find it in your library.
And one of the interesting things was this quote about that racism is not the issue as much as ancestry.
Yes, in fact, racism is not a scientific concept. It has been constructed socially, so we can deconstruct it.
But ancestry is more interesting because it has the nuances and the narratives that are associated with family, and can be parsed a little more easily into parts of where this might be racist, where this might be prejudice, where this might be opening doors to a real conversation about individuals and families. So. Fascinating conversation with Anne and Tori.
So much to say.
And what I really appreciated was when we approached that question about what to do, each of them was entering that question in very different ways. Tori through her work with nonprofits, and through her work with the earth and the land and her associations with our indigenous friends. And I think they both get to different ways of entering into this really difficult conversation. And I was just so grateful for their openness and also for clarity on some of these issues.
And one thing we didn't, I mean, there are many things we didn't get to, but why should we dismantle this system that benefits white people? Of course, it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But it's also the best thing to do. I mean, we're not utilizing the full range of talents and creativity and skills of everybody we live with.
That's right. And in fact, we're barring ourselves from access, and they are barred from offering what they have, the gifts that they have. And so if we can bring that together in an open conversation, I think everybody's an advantage to from dismantling that.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have our work cut out for us.
Yes.
And I also meant to say that we will be coming back in the fall with another conversation on this topic. It's so big and so important. This isn't the end. Yes. Thanks for being with us.